Picking up immediately where the previous installment had left off at, as the Combat Engineer Battalion, one of two, as there was one per brigade, which comprised the 18th Infantry Division, as it was comprised of two brigades, had laid the PB-79A pontoon bridge across the Rio Grande River as rains recently had flooded the river and had made it too wide and too deep for traditional fording of military vehicles or for the scissor bridges to be laid by the M60 AVLBs that equipped each and every combat engineer or combat platoon. As the scissor bridges were not lengthy enough to cross the river, the PB-79A had been launched as the headquarters company at the battalion level had the bridging equipment necessary to utilize this asset in the form of the PB-79A, the Chinese-made pontoon bridge that the Pakistani Army had as their pontoon bridge of choice within their military forces of further combat engineers, and they had launched these pontoon bridge segments and had set them up in 15 minutes' time within the first hour of the invasion alone. As American reactionary armed civilians north of the city had gotten word before more forces had moved into the area of the Pakistani 18th Infantry Division that there were invaders in this area. These were not American military forces, and hence a large grouping of armed reactionary civilians that had banded together north of the city, as mentioned previously, as would naturally occur in real life, had decided they wanted to attack this pontoon bridge, as refugees fleeing the area within the first hour had already informed these civilians that were armed of the actions of the combat engineers establishing this pontoon bridge. In effect, the four-post Russian high-altitude reconnaissance drone had spotted them moving before they had even arrived. The combat engineers were jealously guarding their pontoon bridge crossing as the Pakistani 176th Missile Artillery Regiment had hit every single bridge crossing in the city, minus the I-40 bridge and its adjacent two street bridges, as they were ordered to be kept intact by the CCP regime as per their edicts for the coalition, due to use as later logistical routes and also for the colonization and economic exploitation operations to occur immediately after the invasions succeeded. As these forces also set up the pontoon bridge to have a northern crossing for logistical purposes as well as reinforcing purposes to move troops back and forth as needed, the headquarters battalion of one of the two comprising brigades of the 18th ID had moved in to set up a forward logistical and command post, along with the combat engineer battalion who was guarding the area along both banks. Also moving into the area now was the mechanized infantry battalion that was located north of the combat engineer battalion to cross to seize the Reeves Power Generation Station, the only power plant in Albuquerque itself, as well as a lengthy segment of I-25, one of the most vital objectives of the entire operations within this invasion sector, this area of operations, as the Kirtland Air Force Base was the other besides I-25. And the Pakistani 18th Infantry Division would be largely responsible, for the most part, for I-25, apart from its southern sections, which the Iranian 3rd Armored Brigade would take responsibility of, as the battlefield was divided into quadrants, with the river being a boundary for east-west, and the I-40 being a boundary for north-south on the other side of the river, with the 3rd Armored Brigade of Iran taking the southeast quadrant, while the Pakistani 18th Infantry Division, a larger unit, would take the rest. As by now, the massive fight occurring within this 4 by 2 mile space involved some 880 American armed elements, including military forces comprised of the two companies, with one company of the 1st of the 200th and the other, the Alpha Company of the 2nd of the 198th, which was in Albuquerque to train with them and conduct interoperability training before the invasion had kicked off, as the Americans had no idea an invasion was coming. Naturally, this came as a shock. And as the first 2 hours were spent arduously trying to find a way out using smaller groups to recon the area as they narrowly avoided being heavily shelled and hit by enormous missile barrages coming in from Chinese and Pakistani missiles, coming from both the 176th Pakistani Missile Artillery Regiment firing their Babur Alpha 1s, the same cruise missiles that hit the bridges. These were terrain-hugging, medium-range cruise missiles that were very accurate and had a heavy payload. They were subsonic, but they were destructive and accurate, and they hit the muster and assembly areas, the bivouac sites essentially of the American forces that had narrowly moved out of the way just in time before artillery also saturated much of downtown and continued to do so throughout the course of the battle in this invasion area. As now, the Chinese missiles, including a single DF-100 hypersonic cruise missile that flew so fast a coating of plasma formed around it, which made it stealthy and visible to radar, and it slammed so hard into one of the hotels that the soldiers had been staying in that it made a massive crater with the large payload it carried as well, with also DF-2 strikes coming from the reserve battalions called up to reinforce the brigades of the active forces of the 2 Strategic Missile Forces brigades to add added firepower capabilities to them. They pulled older systems that were earmarked for these battalions out of storage for the battalions, including DF-2s, 3s, and 4s, with the 4s being able to be fired for special scaffolding in Mexico, similar to that used in the North Korean ballistic missile program, as these had exceptionally long range and with a conventional payload were enormously destructive. DF-2s and 3s also had ample range and the ability to carry a large payload. As the DF-10A cruise missiles, which are subsonic long-range cruise missiles, were operated by these reserve battalions as well. These were a mass-produced weapon system that was widely available to these strategic missile forces with ample ammunition in order to be reloaded and continually fired. And these also slammed into the area with immense force and immense destruction. And the bivouac sites were essentially, along with the rest of downtown, turned into a cratered, ruined wasteland as artillery and missiles of Chinese and Pakistani origin slammed into the area, with Iranian missiles largely concentrated on Kirtland, as well as even the outer outskirts of the airport itself, such as the FedEx area and other sorts of postal and other types of parcel services in that area, as the Shahab 2s continue to come in as well. By now, the Americans were fleeing the area and now were part of the 880 total American forces within this 2-by-4 mile battle space, as 590 armed reactionary civilians, including some in the south on both sides of the river, along with the 240 American military forces of 2 companies, one mechanized infantry and the other tank company, the Alpha Company, moved into the area as these military forces were trying to effect a breakout, as their plan, essentially more or less, was to flee the city, break their way out, and abandon their vehicles once they ran out of gas, as they could not sustain them, and flee into the wilderness and come up with a new plan some kind of way, as they had no plan. They only had a plan to escape, as that was their only plan. And the other mechanized infantry battalion would try to break out across the river, crossing the last remaining bridges. However, they would be stymied by both the recently arriving combat engineer battalion of the other brigade of the Pakistani 18th Infantry Division, as well as the armored battalion arriving into the area, and would be prevented from crossing in a fever-pitched battle that would occur over the bridge, as the street bridges and highway bridge would be hotly contested in this area just as much as the pontoon bridge area would be as well, even though the Americans, as it pertained to the military forces, didn't quite know there was a pontoon bridge there just as of yet, but they would find out as they approached and were informed of it. And the forces defending these areas of the combat engineers would be heavily armed and able to repel any type of force, as they were equipped with very potent anti-armor weapons such as the Alcaton one-time use Spanish-made anti-tank system, which they bulked up on before the invasion but already had sufficient numbers of. They also had the Chinese-made Type 69 rocket-propelled grenades, which fired both the anti-armor and anti-personnel ammunition, and they had ample numbers of those, as they had bulked up on those over the years, as China made an unquantifiable number of these weapons and had such an immense stockpile. It was literally unquantifiable. It couldn't be counted, in other words. And they also possessed the HJ-08 anti-tank missiles, like such here, being fired from a soldier right off the map in this wedge formation of troops advancing. The Iranians would also provide limited support in this battle with their Shahed 238 loitering munitions, as these loitering munitions were in high demand for their own forces and the Pakistanis throughout the battlefield, and they would be able to fire 5 in support, as their combat drone company, with its different combat drone sections and their TEL-like systems, would be very busy throughout this entire battle, just as much as the artillery forces, such as the Pakistani artillery from their 155 M198 howitzers, as well as also the mortar tracks, the M106 American-made mortar tracks that had the French-made LLR mortars that were procured by Pakistan for their military as their chief mortar, their 81 millimeter mortar system, who would be firing ample numbers of mortars in support of their mechanized infantry troops, as these were part of the mechanized infantry battalions and acted as their fire support company in each battalion, as there was a company of mortar forces per battalion. As these LLR 81 millimeter mortars were highly effective and were completely ISR directed every bit as much as the artillery and air power and more, as these mortars would be dead-on accurate and hit their targets 100% of the time. As this mortar team here is firing a mortar, this soldier had just put a mortar in and covered his ears, fired, and this other soldier back here is pulling another one off the racks. NCO on his handheld radio set, weapon slung, soldier patrolling the area on the mortar line, the mortar gun line, and this soldier in the prone position with his squad automatic weapon, essentially an RPD Chinese version, the Type 56-1, as the Pakistanis use these as their squad automatic weapons, and they use the MG3, German-made but Pakistani licensed produced, as their general-purpose machine gun in many cases. They had others, but this was the most reliable with the fastest rate of fire, and fired the 7.62x51 NATO, while they used their Type 56s and their new PK-21 Pakistani-made rifles as their standard military assault rifles. As the PK-21 was starting to circulate, it too was a 7.62x39 and meant to phase out the older Type 56 Chinese rifles, which even the Chinese didn't use anymore in frontline service except for some of their third-rate national militia forces back home. As the mechanized infantry forces were now beginning to cross the pontoon bridge in the city in the outer suburbs of Rio Rancho, they would end up clashing with American forces who would give them a bloody nose when it came to the advance company to cross the river first out of the battalion, as the mechanized infantry battalion was made up of 6 mechanized infantry companies with their Al-Fad Saudi-made IFVs and APCs. These were the wheeled armored fighting vehicles in both versions. They equipped the mechanized infantry forces. They would receive a bloody nose as the American armored forces and mechanized infantry forces moving up parallel to the river on its east bank would end up clashing with this company, the 1st Mechanized Infantry Company to cross. Although they would not defeat the Pakistani forces, who had overwhelming advantages over them with the ISR dominance, firepower dominance, total support from the air, from mortars, from artillery, from loitering munitions, and their own heavy weapons they carried on their dismounts and vehicle-based weapons. The Americans, nonetheless, were equipped with very potent weapons of their own, despite their disadvantages in losing total communications and ISR, losing comms due to the Chinese KG-600 electromagnetic jamming pods, the latest and greatest in electronic warfare systems, along with some other Chinese and Russian systems, such as the Russian Kibini, that equipped these very powerful JH-7 ground attack aircraft that were over the area, were jamming the redundant radio communications and made it impossible for American forces to communicate effectively, minus hand gestures and word-of-mouth communications and runners spreading messages. This was no way to communicate in a modern, fluid, ever-evolving battlefield, and would essentially mean that America was in the Stone Age while the coalition was in the Information Age, far advanced compared to them. But the weapons wielded by the Americans were still capable of causing casualties, and they would do so. They would end up causing KIAs in a decent number amid the first company to cross the PB-79A pontoon bridge of the Pakistani forces as they crossed. Although the Americans were seen coming literally miles away as they moved from downtown into the north of the city before leaving it, as they entered this northernmost area of Albuquerque. Everything from this line below is Albuquerque proper. Everything above it is Rio Rancho, the outer suburbs of Albuquerque, as Rio Rancho gave way to housing developments, which gave way to high plateau desert. The American forces of the military forces present were trying to make their way to this plateau and hopefully to the mountains and national forest, the wilderness area. But Pakistani air power, although they're very powerful and capable, advanced JF-17Bs, would not be participating in this particular part of the battle. The Mirage 5s would, and the Mirage 5s were fully capable of delivering crippling blows, especially specifically of the number 8 squadron. This specific squadron had their Mirage 5s tailored to fire the Ra'ad standoff air-to-ground cruise missiles, which carried a very potent payload of almost 1,000 square pounds, as it was over 900 pounds of HE, which would devastate opponents, as well as the 30mm autocannon from strafing attacks from these aircraft as they came in and strafed their targets as well, and dropped thousands of pounds of munitions on enemy targets. As one would fire its Ra'ads at American forces just off the map, as there was a small number of them out of the area, as technically this battlefield extended beyond the 2 by 4 mile area. The Ra'ads being fired at these forces off map, essentially with the drop munitions, the massive artillery strikes as they came in, and the flanking attack by a firing battery comprised of Type 59-1, Chinese Type 59-1 57mm air defense guns, which can be utilized in a ground attack role and pointed at enemy targets and would be a scourge on vehicles and personnel alike. These air defense guns of the local air defense battalion in the area, as there was the Pakistani Shorad battalion, one of 2 from each brigade in the area, moving south to assist in defending the pontoon bridge, and they would commit a battery of theirs, as they had 4 batteries of HQ-7Ps, which were short-range air defense missiles, the Chinese-made HQ-7s that were Pakistani exported, as the P was for Pakistan. And they had 3 batteries of these air defense guns, these 57mm potent air defense cannons. And they would move into the area and line up and pepper this whole area with 57mm fire, as these blasting rounds would tear up these homes, personnel, technicals, and anything else that was living. As the combo of the airstrikes, the 57mm flanking fire as it was hitting these personnel on their flanks, the directed ISR artillery strikes that were ISR directed as per the quadcopter recon drones at the company level of these Pakistani forces present, as well as the high-altitude recon assets consisting of the Russian 4-post high-altitude recon drone orbiting the area and the Chinese WZ-8, while the Iranian Mohajer-6 continued to monitor the entire south of the battle space. As this battle was in full swing by now, as it begun at 2, the first company out of the mechanized infantry battalion entering this area of the city, as there were some rubbled buildings, as these buildings had been destroyed by earlier shelling that was directed by ISR assets to hit armed reactionary civilians early on to soften up the area for the combat engineers to enter, which they did, and establish control over both banks in these parkland areas here and this neighborhood, as there was a street running parallel to the river here, as well as also a neighborhood here that basically exited out into deserty land, such as where this ranch was, where these armed reactionary civilians got annihilated by these two dismounted air defense squads of air defense troops, as they were fully combat trained and including in tactical formations. They attacked this ranch property, this squad from higher elevation, firing down upon them as they broke into a line. They folded out into a line formation from a wedge, and they fired down on these forces as they did the same thing by the time they reached this fence, and vectored their fire in an L shape and completely annihilated all of them as the fire coming from them hit these personnel and hit these personnel. There's nowhere they could go from the intersecting fields of fire. All of these forces tactically would have intersecting fields of fire, which was very important, as to be able to cover one another in terms of your forces meant everything, as forces could concentrate fire wherever needed, all at once if needed. And these tactical formations of these dismounted squads of combat engineers with their armored fighting vehicles, they used the same wheeled armored fighting vehicles as did the mechanized infantry. They used the Alfads. These forces were highly effective. They had their forces basically in a line to guard all approaches to the pontoon bridge, so that the mechanized infantry battalion could basically continue on undisturbed and cross with ease without having to stop themselves and fight these forces. The combat engineers guarding the area would do it for them. This platoon moving in to fold out into this area to connect with this platoon was part of this same company, as one platoon was here. Their headquarters platoon was in the middle for safety. They basically did a protective formation around them. This platoon was arriving a little late of this company here and was folding out to form a continuous line with this other combat engineer company, with these troops taking cover in the rubble of this former building, and these troops in a line formation, continuous line formation. All these squads had dismounted from their IFVs and APC versions of the Alfad and had made a continuous line in the prone position while their vehicles sat behind them as heavy fire support platforms that cut these forces down as they emerged from their areas of advance where they came from. And as they tried to take cover behind homes and they tried to lay down and avoid being hit, they were being hit nonetheless. All of this heavy fire being vectored by the dismounts, by the vehicles, all into this area was annihilating everything with the artillery strikes, the air strikes, as these two 1,000-pounders are going to hit this area and cause mass devastation. Even the Shahed 238 strikes, which hit this technical and these personnel dismounts by this clump of mesquite trees here. Well, these other personnel are moving in. An artillery strike is called in, which cuts these personnel down and wipes all these personnel out, as indicated by the arrow encapsulated in orange. And as all these personnel over here have formed up along this ridge line right above the river, as higher ground begins in this area and it gets ever higher as one leaves the city and heads north, they're being pounded by these air defense guns by the time the battery reaches here and lines up, and they will continue to fire into this area until they're all annihilated before they move to their final position, which will be right here. But for now, they're laying down enormous fire, and they're getting some return fire, as this arrow indicates, as there's some green on the tip of it. They've already destroyed this technical and these two technicals trying to flee in great haste out of this area. Their company quadcopter assets scouting the area ahead had seen their movement. Their MRAP from their headquarters platoon, positioned right here by these dismounts that are accompanying the column of trucks with their truck-mounted Type 59-1 57mm air defense guns, which are radar-directed, as each firing platoon has a radar to direct the fire of these very powerful air defense guns, these short-range SHORAD systems. they've fired at these technicals. They're trying to flee out of this neighborhood like a bat out of hell, proverbially speaking, and they were completely cut up by 12.7 millimeter fire and small arms fire from this double column formation of troops that are accompanying the battery, with the lead platoon moving here before moving here and setting up. They briefly paused while this was being concluded, and then they moved and set up. This again is the Amtrak line in the mauve color coding for the rail runner Amtrak line, which runs through the city and nearly parallel to the river in most areas. It goes and bends and goes downtown from here. As this neighborhood here would essentially be the area where the Russian medevac forces would come and pick up the critically wounded that were about to occur from the fighting with the Americans, as the American armored forces, although they lacked ISR, actionable intel, any communications, they still had capable equipment in the form of their M1 Abrams battle tanks with their very potent 120 millimeter main guns. They had two machine gun emplacements on these vehicle turrets. They had a 50 cal M2 50 cal, and a 240 Bravo, which was a 7.62 NATO. They had a 7.62 NATO coax, and they were very capable vehicles with their very capable fire control systems and ballistic computers and all the other standard features in a main battle tank. They still had good armor protection for the most part, but all their contemporary tanks were fully capable of destroying them, as has been proven in recent times in Yemen, and Eastern Europe, and elsewhere. These tanks were not invincible by any means and could be relatively easily destroyed depending on the weapons utilized against it and where the tank was hit exactly as well. And the Pakistani combat engineers and the mechanized infantry forces had fully capable anti-tank capabilities with their Al-Qatan, which could destroy an Abrams, as well as also their HJ-08 anti-tank missiles and their license-produced versions in Pakistan, as they produce these Chinese missiles themselves in their Taksala factories. And these vehicles, although not quite capable of destroying an Abrams with their 40 millimeter autocannon or their 12.7 millimeter turret-based machine gun, they could deploy the troops that could with their anti-armor weapons. Although the Type 69 rocket-propelled grenade couldn't quite destroy an Abrams, the Al-Qatan and the HJ-08 definitely could. And they would be utilized to great effect against the M1 tanks and the mechanized infantry forces of the Americans, as again, the first of the 200th had effectively been split between Santa Fe and Albuquerque. The two companies in Albuquerque had split up, one going with Alpha Company, the tank company of the Americans from the Texas Guard, from the 155th Armored Brigade combat teams, second of the 198th, and the support platoon from the support company of the first of the 200th has effectively been lost. They got lost and they're stuck in downtown trying to find their own way out, just as one company went to the west, to the riverbank, to the bridges. The Alpha Company and the other mechanized infantry company went into this battle and would have to fight their way out, but would never make it, as the firepower and ISR dominance was just far too much, and they were also vastly outnumbered by the Pakistani forces in the area. Although in total, the Americans had 880 combatants between all their armed reactionary civilians, which numbered 590, plus the 50 paramilitary forces that were stuck on the western side of the river in this area. The 240 American troops between these two companies, the Mechanized Infantry Company and the Tank Company, would basically end up all being destroyed, as they would be seen as the primary threat once the hordes of armed reactionary civilians in the north had been firmly dealt with, which was still ongoing as the Mechanized Infantry Battalion, moving into the area here, had sent across its first advanced company of its battalion, its first mechanized infantry company, to cross, and they would cross in strength and get across and then head south, because their initial objective anyhow was again to go for the Reeves Power Station and I-25. But armed reactionary civilians were in the way, and these American military forces as they moved north into this area. Because immediately to the slight southeast by half a kilometer, 500 meters to the southeast of this battle map, was another battle that was set to begin as armed reactionary civilians were in this area, and the mechanized infantry battalion had left its headquarters platoon behind, as they were following up behind but ended up taking a wrong turn into the area where the power plant was. And as the Pakistani battalion would get all its forces across in strength for the whole battalion, they would make for the power plant. And another battle would ensue right after this one, but this one would last an hour and a half until 3:30 as it started at 2. As on this side, essentially, of this side of the river, this down here in the southwest was more of a sideshow with these paramilitary forces and these armed reactionary civilians running like hell, getting out of this area because immediately off map, massive artillery bombardments are hitting this area, and they fled to the river and ended up into this area. There's another mechanized infantry battalion moving into the area at the time of this battle as well, on the other side of the river. And they're trying to flee from all this, only to find that the bridges have all been taken out by the Babur Alpha 1s, and now they're trapped, and now they're trying to flee further south. But ISR-directed mortar strikes come in from the Pakistani mortar forces of the Mechanized Infantry Battalion, firing their mortars from their gun line of mortars, some mortar tracks, all these mortar systems firing ample mortars, and these could be fired quickly, and they could also be readjusted quickly. As they are all ISR directed, they are slamming into these trucks, these technicals and SUVs. Essentially, these are trucks and SUVs with armed men, so they are technicals by definition. As they're fleeing the area, they're being hit by mortars, one after another, hitting the same street area. Also hitting this area as well with all these armed reactionary civilians moving in. They're being hit and destroyed. As that's going on, these paramilitary forces are trying to move up, but are being engaged by combat engineers. One platoon of combat engineers moving this way. They left their headquarters platoon behind off map. Three vehicles of their headquarters platoon, however, have moved up, though, to move into this parking lot to act as supply forces and medivac forces as they moved in their ambulance truck into the area. Their Shangji truck they're using as an ambulance. They have combat medics in it. They don't have an armored ambulance vehicle, but they have a truck for their forces and the combat engineers and the mechanized infantry. As these forces move into the area, these two Shangji supply trucks, they're setting up in this parking lot to be forward supply forces to run ammo to their combat engineers and more. As the Americans essentially have no such thing, as they've lost most of their logistics in the earlier missile strikes and massive artillery strikes from the massive barrage launched by both Pakistani artillery battalions, firing massive volleys of 155 shells into the city. They essentially lost the vast majority of their supplies at their bivouac sites, and their logistics were next to none other than what they had in their vehicles and other than what their headquarters platoons possessed, and this headquarters platoon had been thoroughly annihilated as 4,000 pounds of airdrop munitions were dropped onto this apartment complex where they had set up at, while their forces went forward to probe the area for enemies as they planned to make a breakout. These armed reactionary civilian technicals are getting mortared and annihilated as they move into this area. These mortars are being dropped on them and they're destroying them. As these forces were already being hit over here with heavy mortar strikes by this gas station, by these houses and shops over here, as this was a mixed commercial and residential area, of course, a lot of small stores and bigger shops and office buildings, such as the types where small businesses can rent office space, or even corporation office buildings, and of course apartment complexes outside of the city in the suburbs here, and a gated home, a more elaborate house and middle-class housing, upper-class housing over here, big time, and middle-class housing, parking lot for the park that's down this dead-end street where the parking lot is for this park, bridge up here following the street turning this way, bridge, another street that basically dead ends to the park, but Also, there's a house with a driveway connected to it, but it has a connecting street right here. Buildings that were offices and shops, housing neighborhood, gas station, big parking lot, nicer homes. The combat engineers are moving into an area that their ISR assets had spotted American activity, dropped mortars on these paramilitary forces. While a squad of paramilitary agents, or troops rather, in SWAT gear essentially, are moving up through these backyards, they're going to clash with the dismounted squad from this platoon as they dismount a single squad. And they exchange fire briefly with them from across this chain link fence. They clash with them. They saw these paramilitary forces first with their ISR assets, and they get the drop on them and cut them all down. As the mortars already got them, as the ISR assets drop mortars on this house and outside of it and just cut them all down. These forces then move in here, while these vehicles, although they're exchanging fire briefly with these MRAPs, these Max Pro MRAPs used by the paramilitary forces with their light machine guns, 40 millimeter fire from this lead IFV just destroys these. It shreds these to pieces before these two platoons of combat engineers, as there was a platoon here that dismounted a full squad, just one squad from their vehicles. They break up here and go two different directions because their plan, as they know from the four-post Russian drone and WZ-7 Chinese high-altitude drone orbiting the area, they knew that the Americans were coming. And their main objective, besides dealing with the paramilitary threat here, which they, by the time this platoon gets here and runs through this house and fence and just destroys it, they exchange fire briefly with this MRAP that moves up and destroy it. They annihilate it with 40 millimeter fire from the lead IFV, the same IFV that destroyed these two with 40 mil fire. As the 40 millimeter autocannon, again, was a devastating weapon. It was a monster of an autocannon, much more powerful than the 20 millimeter used on the Bradley, the 30 on Chinese and Russian and other Eastern vehicles mostly, as well as also the 35 used on some Chinese vehicles. This was a monster autocannon on the Saudi-made vehicle, and it destroyed, totally annihilated the Max Pro MRAPs utilized by the paramilitary forces. They were not armored enough to take that kind of a hit. They couldn't take a hit from a 20 millimeter. They definitely couldn't take a hit from a 40. It just shredded them up. So they were all destroyed. These paramilitary forces completely annihilated, including the ones inside the vehicles too, the ones that didn't dismount. There's another paramilitary vehicle right here, but by the time this platoon on this side got here, down this highway, which was really a boulevard, but it was a numbered highway known as 528. This large boulevard ran through the city, across this bridge, and went all the way to the Cottonwood Mall area, a big mall and shopping district. And although it wasn't like a traditional four-lane highway, it was just a big boulevard essentially. But as they went to the destroyed bridge, they took up position here because they planned to assist the other forces of theirs, their mechanized infantry company of their mechanized infantry battalion, the advanced company sent across first, as it took them some time to get across the bridge. So they were now moving into place by the time these forces were moving into place here, and they had eliminated the paramilitary forces, including now moving down here and destroying them. As they got here, they exchanged fire. The lead IFV destroyed them as they moved up and tried to exchange fire. Now they moved down here, and they were engaging with American forces that had survived the earlier air attacks, the close air support that was ISR directed onto these forces as they were moving in. This aircraft had fired its 30 millimeter cannon, nose cannon, the Mirage 5 here, as well as the Ra'ad cruise missiles, with their 1,000 pound payload nearly, as they had an over 900 pound payload, not quite 1,000, but very close to it. Very destructive weapons, and they strafed this column here, these two columns, the tank column of these two tank platoons, and these platoons were divvied up with 4 vehicles here, 4 vehicles here, and 4 vehicles here. They destroyed a Bradley, they destroyed 2 M113s and a tank with this missile here, which was hitting the tank, and they strafed this M113. So all of this fire came in and wiped out some of these vehicles right offhand. And fire was coming from the lead IFV of these combat engineers firing across the river and blasting this M113 to pieces before then turning and beginning to fire over here, because they were already starting to fire their heavy machine gun across the river from all the way over here down at these vehicles. They could see them with their ISR assets from their combat engineer company, who was securing the flanks to the south of the pontoon bridges. Again, they were guarding the area jealously, including to the north, where they had forces fanned out. They had their headquarters platoon in the middle for protection, which is their command and logistical forces of their company. Same was over here, so with one platoon arriving late, fanning out to link up with the other platoon of their company, as they had one platoon arranged like this in their headquarters in the middle. This this company rather, was moving into place with one platoon going this way and two going this way here. They were moving down now, this platoon, into place after all the paramilitary forces were annihilated. And essentially, these forces broke into two groups, where they only used their armored fighting vehicles and left their M60 AVLB behind, because that wasn't going to be effective enough for the fight they were about to engage in, as, again, they only had a general purpose machine gun on that vehicle and it carried a bridge. It was cumbersome, so they left it behind. They sent forward the AFV, or the armored fighting vehicles, AFVs, the IFV and APCs, the Alfads, which moved forward, smashed through this fence, and begun to engage the Americans as they moved up. And these other vehicles with their 12.7s from across the river firing at the lighter, weaker armored personnel carriers of the Americans, the M113s, as the Bradleys are being hit by the IFVs of the combat engineers firing their 40mm autocannons and their 12.7mm anti-materiel heavy machine guns for good measure, as these IFVs were highly destructive. They would play a massive role in destroying these columns, as much of this entire grouping right here was already annihilated, with each of these platoons already losing two vehicles right off the bat. Well, this one 3. Now that the combat engineers were opening fire on them, they just fired through this building, shredded it up. All of it was ISR directed by their company's quadcopter assets. As the headquarters platoon had already been crippled, annihilated by these airdrop munitions, which destroyed all these apartment buildings, as well as these mortar strikes came in and destroyed these houses with these vehicles here in this building, and this vehicle here in this parking lot area. They tried to break through the fence into this apartment complex, and they got hit by mortars after they saw this happen. These tanks of this platoon had survived just barely the airdrop munitions, which destroyed their company commander, first sergeant, all their logistical forces, their fueler, their armored recovery, all their supplies, everything they had left supply-wise other than what was in their vehicles, destroyed. Now the lead tank would be destroyed, as the mechanized infantry company from the mechanized infantry battalion had made it across, moving through these office buildings here in this area. It's a shopping center, parking lots, housing neighborhood, apartment complex. This was in the suburbs. Remember, this is Albuquerque. They're now just leaving Albuquerque into the suburbs of Rio Rancho. As the tanks get here, they had to go around a destroyed tank, because as these forces got here, their platoons split up effectively. As these forces were here, they had gotten here and split their platoons up. Now, these tanks had outstanding optics, but they couldn't see the vehicles as they broke up and went behind the buildings exactly, because they didn't have any ISR assets. They could only see what they could with their tank optics, which they had outstanding optics and could see way up the street. But buildings in a city block your view. They obstruct your view. Also made it difficult for the Bradley's optics as well. As they moved into place, their image intensifiers really did them no good with all the obstructions, and they were being hit by ISR-directed fire from the armored fighting vehicles of the combat engineers, including those now moving here, firing down at them like those that moved here and broke into two prongs, firing at them in an L shape. Highly destructive, highly devastating. firing at them, vectoring fire, angle and traverse, all dictated by the ISR and AI working together and sending back data real time to the forces on the ground. As this revolutionized warfare, this gave the Pakistanis an incredible edge over the Americans because they were grafted into the Chinese and Russian AI real-time battlefield processing data systems. And as the American tanks, though good that they were, and the Bradleys, which were moderately good too, moved up and began to engage with the Pakistani forces here, these forces exchanging fire back and forth, though the Bradley would end up damaging one of the armor personnel carriers of the combat engineer platoon here, the other combat engineer platoon hitting them from the side, they reacted too late and were getting cut down. So by the time they reached this position right here, they had already lost a few vehicles. And as they continued to move up here to maneuver around, they were now being hit by the vehicles of one platoon's AFV and their AFV firing across the river in an X-vectored fire, which destroyed what remained of this vehicle column of M113s and Bradleys, as there was really only 2 Bradleys left and the rest were M113s in this column. And in this column, there was only 1 Bradley left and 1 APC. And by the time they moved between these homes here, where the shop was and went around, these forces engaged them back and forth as the Bradley fired its 20mm autocannon and prepped to fire a tow. It was destroyed by the 40mm autocannon fire. And this squad that had dismounted, as this platoon went around this parking lot and dismounted its forces, all 5 of its squads. Its vehicles then turned and went parallel down this street. But while that was happening, parallel to their squads they dismounted, as that was happening, these combat engineers, now that the mech infantry company got across, remember at the beginning they destroyed these armed reactionary civilians as they took this area here, they now began to push out each of their combat platoons, leaving their headquarters platoon in place to stand in the area in the park, adjacent to this apartment complex and this walled-off house, this nice house. As these forces now are moving in place, one platoon went this way through the apartment complex while the other went down through the middle. And as that happened, these armed civilians came out of these houses and began to move up the street. And as they did, they were cut down by fire from the platoon of vehicles right here, firing from their armored fighting vehicles, their 40mm, their 12.7mm. They just cut them up. They didn't even get to put up really much of a fight. They fired 1 round into the vehicle, did nothing. They fired a rifle into the vehicle. That was all they managed to do, and they were cut down. As that happened, the American tank platoon over here began to move, and as they were moving up the street, as these forces moved here, as this fighting was going on right here and was winding up, as these vehicles were being annihilated in their columns, what remained of them as they made it to this point around this shopping plaza, this shopping plaza would be horribly hit by the powerful 120mm main gun of the M1 Abrams tanks, as well as 50 cal fire and 7.62 by 51 NATO fire, as they fired into this building, this shopping center, where these squads kicked in the back doors and went in and were now firing out of them with HJ-08 anti-tank missiles almost point blank, as well as Al-Qatans, which were destroying these Abrams tanks, although they fired into the building and did horrible damage to it and caused a lot of KIAs among these different squads, though not all of them, but they had gotten a decent number of them. Out of the 50 men of this platoon, they would manage to cause 30 KIAs due to the devastating fire, because there would be some critically wounded and some would succumb to their wounds. As these vehicles would move up, these tanks, before the last tank would be destroyed by an Al-Qatan, it would fire into this vehicle column and manage to destroy the lead vehicle, the lead IFV, while these tanks, again, had been moving up and moved through these properties here because they had witnessed the firefight going on over here between the vehicles, and had moved up and decided to outflank the vehicles of this platoon, while these tanks continue to move straight up the street and were now being engaged by dismounted combat engineers, as this platoon moving into the area had dismounted squads with them. And as they got here, the dismounts behind the vehicles came out from behind the vehicles and began to fire anti-tank weapons such as Al-Qatans, as well as also HJ-08 anti-tank missiles. And even RPGs, the Type 69 rocket-propelled grenades at enemy targets, and had destroyed these two tanks, both of them in a line, and one tried to go around the destroyed tank. It got destroyed in turn. But over here, these tanks helped in destroying this entire vehicle column before they, too, were in turn destroyed, but they also cut down this squad as well with their 50 cal turret gunner firing and cutting the squad down as they went around and they were destroying the last tanks with those inside. And as that happened, these squads began to fire at them from the gutted building and destroy both of these tanks. But they lost most of their platoon by this point. As combat medics were rushing back and forth, these were the combat medics right here, they were rushing back and forth as the Russians were already inbound because they had already gotten word of severe casualties. Although there were no major casualties in the fight against the armed reactionary civilians, the combat against the American military forces, however, had been a bit more intense than was anticipated. As again, they seen the Americans coming, they thought they were ready for them, but the Americans were tenacious, and they too were jittery and on high alert and ready for anything. These were very well-trained tank crews. Had they been more novice tank crews that didn't have a lot of experience or time behind the armor, they would have been wiped out easily and quickly. However, these tank crews responded relatively quickly despite their handicaps of no ISR capabilities and no communications, and they ended up working together as these tanks could see the trouble going on in this area, as these tanks were in a life and death struggle against these dismounted mechanized infantry soldiers, as well as their vehicles, which were all destroyed in this platoon. This platoon lost all their vehicles and much of their dismounts, but their dismounts finally managed to win against this tank element here of this tank company, that what was left of these tank platoons, which was 6 tanks by the time they got here. And they destroyed all 6 tanks with Al-Qatans, like so, and also the combat engineers ended up having to assist with firing their Al-Qatans, RPGs, their Type 69s, as well as their HJ-08 anti-tank missiles, which ended up destroying these tanks, while the surviving members of these squads of this platoon here that went this way ended up destroying these tanks with their anti-tank weapons, and while the combat medics were feverishly rushing back and forth to get these critically wounded personnel to the landing zone, which is this X right here. As the Russian Mi-17s of the VVS detachment that was with the 8th Combined Arms Army were hurriedly flying into the area to pick up the critically wounded casualties, as the combat engineers also had a platoon go into this area, and they sent a squad in here to possibly assist, and they ended up guarding the area for the passage of combat medics, that should be mentioned. As the combat medics hurriedly got them to the LZ, the Russians would fly off as fast as they could to their CCP regime property, whereupon they had a secret medical facility that they had constructed beneath their CCP regime property for the express purpose of treating critically wounded soldiers. It had an ICU and everything. It had been built over the decades that China had owned properties in America. Many other facilities like so existed throughout the land, and even more in-depth properties had been constructed secretly upon these CCP regime assets, where they had constructed all manner of facilities, even command and control bunkers and more. Americans had no idea what had been going on right under their nose for decades within their own nation, and they would suffer critically for it, as the coalition would come down on them hard with everything they had, leave their nation and their military in smoky ruins, as artillery, air power, and more simply devastated their nation and crippled it and its ability to respond to even what was happening to it in a minute-by-minute basis. As the coalition was everywhere, ubiquitous, and was smashing everything with impunity. More in the next installment of this hypothetical invasion documentary series highlighting fourth-generation warfare doctrines.